which language to use, and Alan said, I'm using both. So, and I'll do the same, and maybe Andrew will do the same. If someone who is mother tongue English doesn't understand Italian, please hand up, half and half, yes. So this is why we are saying, okay, we are doing it in English. The other question is, how many Italian doesn't understand English? Okay, this is a democratic assembly, so we do it in English. But this book is in Italian, so I start with this book in Italian and then split it to English, okay? Or not. Okay. Alan Friedman, do you know, he's very famous in Italy. He wrote a lot of books about the Italian mess. And for the first time, this book is about the American mess, and we are very proud of it, because sometimes it's good to say that there are mess everywhere and not only in Italy. And Andrew Spada is a journalist, and he is a politologo, how do you say it? Political analyst, and he has a blog whose name is transatlantico.info, and the both predicted in some way the Trump will gonna win. So there are two topics in both books very interesting to me, because there are, one is the economic sides of the matter, and one is where the USA is put in the foreign affairs. So these are the two big topics in both books. And I will start with Alan, which his book is this is the book, and is first on the top 10 this week. Yeah, so he's very proud. He arrived and said, "My book is first." Okay, and I said it, and you're glad. And this book starts with a very impressive description of Trump in his plane. Tell us about this. This is the first meeting that he had with Trump, and it was quite impressive to me to understand what kind of person is Trump.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. I started the book with the meeting I had with Trump on the plane, although I'd like to make clear that although I predicted that Trump would be president back in February 2016 in the Corriere della Sera, at the time I wrote in Italian that this is a cafone who you have to take very seriously, and indeed the cafone is now the president of the United States. Cafone in Italian, for those who don't speak Italian, I suppose you could translate as vulgarian. This book is more about why Trump was elected, what happened to America. The first half of the book is a piece of social anthropology, if you wish, in which I traveled to 16 states from Mississippi to Ohio, around the country, to look at the poverty, the racism, the violence, the gun violence, and the state of our divided nation. And of course, when it comes to the election of Trump, many people ask me, well, why did he get elected? And I usually say there's three main reasons why Trump was elected. Number one, because he had a very poor rival in Hillary Clinton, Democratic candidate who was hated and not trusted by 60% of the American people. Same as Trump, but a poor rival. The Americans were sick of the Clintons, and Hillary was just not a good candidate. Secondly, mainly, Trump, together with the help of people like Stephen Bannon, his chief strategist, were able to exploit the fear and the anger of a lot of poor white people who saw in Trump a kind of savior. I will get you jobs, I will build a wall, I will close the border, you know, and all these empty promises given in the style of an, you know, third world strongman. The authoritarian nature of his campaign and the authoritarian nature of the government right now is very worrying to those of us who believed once in the human rights being an American value and in international order. The third reason why Trump was elected was because there was Russian involvement in the campaign. We don't know to what extent Russian secret agents were working actively together with Trump's people, although there is some circumstantial evidence that suggests that. But we do know that there was hacking by the Russians of the Hillary machinery. We do know that that was given to WikiLeaks, and we do know that some of Trump's top people were giving advance word about what would come out from the Russian hackers. So this will be the biggest scandal in the American government for the next few months, the Russiagate scandal, and is the only thing that can undo the Trump presidency in the next year or so. I don't believe in impeachment. I don't think Republicans will impeach a Republican president, but the Russiagate scandal is what you should keep your eye on. Donald Trump himself, who I knew first in the 80s and then met again during the campaign on his airplane, his Boeing 757, is a superficial and relatively ignorant man. He's like a lot of nouveau riche Americans who learn about super Tuscan wines and try to make a good impression and try to penetrate high society. And for years and years, for decades, he tried to break into the ranks of Manhattan's Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue elite, because Donald Trump has a complex as an outsider. He comes from the suburbs of the Queens. He feels that he's somehow inadequate. And of course, this sense of inferiority psychologically turns into a bully, so that he has become a bully not just in the campaign and certainly concerning women. During the campaign, he insulted women, bragged about sexual molestation of women. As president, he is cutting funding for abortion, cutting funding for Planned Parenthood, cutting women's rights. So we have a very extreme and unprecedented situation, and I'll leave it to the readers if they want to see why impressions of Donald Trump inside the airplane with the gold toilets and the gold seat belts and all that kitsch. They can read the opening pages of This Is Not America. The Italian edition is out now. The English edition will be out in June.
Okay. Do you wrote this in Italian or in
English?
In
of
English,
course, I'm
and you
American.
translate- Yeah, okay.
The publisher is my
Because
Italian.
I think it is the first time did you speak about this book in English.
Today is the first time I've spoken about it in English, although I've spoken on radio in America about it. But in
this is
Italy,
quite
it's
peculiar.
unusual for me to be in Italy and speaking
Yeah.
English. It's enjoyable.
So, okay.
I can be a bit more sharp about Trump. When I was being interviewed before, I actually said the words I say in Italian. I said Trump and Berlusconi are both pathological narcissists. And it sounded a lot stronger in English than in Italian.
Okay. So Andrew, Andrew told me just right now that he was elected president of Foreign Press Association in Milan, and his book is Perché vince Trump. He was written why Trump won. No, will win, because he wrote the book before the presidential elections. So in Alan Friedman's view, Trump is more than like an evil, something like evil. What's your opinion about Trump? And I will tell you, what's your opinion about what Alan said about the Russian connection and Russian implication in the election?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I wrote my book in April of last year in Italian. I wrote it. And my goal was to explain why Trump was winning and why, on the other side, Bernie Sanders was doing very well in the Democratic primaries. And there was another outsider candidate, Ted Cruz, in the Republican side. Because the issue to me in the U.S. election campaign in 2016 is that no one wanted to recognize the underlying process. The underlying process was you've had 30 years at least of an economic policy which has left out a large portion of the U.S. population, and something very similar has happened in Europe, although to a different extent. And therefore, the idea that everything is going great, which is what we mostly heard about how the economy was doing so well, how it recovered after 2008, 2009, for many people just wasn't true. So when someone showed up on both sides, both the Democratic and the Republican side, and stopped repeating the same things which many people see are not true, well then, people voted for him. And they voted for him even though Donald Trump's got all these problems, because Donald Trump is obviously was and is, does not have the experience to be president, right? And he obviously, the criticisms that he's made of the U.S. establishment and elite were very effective. That doesn't mean he has the solutions to how to change them, but they were very effective. And I think the biggest problem was that there was not an effective response on the other side. Right? So the campaign, in this sense, was not. I think that Donald Trump is an effect of what happened, not the cause of what happened. And there's too much focus on Trump himself during the campaign. And we're going back to a situation now where I think there is, again, a superficial view of what's going on. There are all the problems with Donald Trump. Donald Trump has all the negatives are evident. We see them every day, right? What we need to talk about, though, is is there something he's actually trying to change? And there are two major things. And I don't know if he will, if he will succeed, if he actually knows how to do it or not. But one, obviously, is economic policy. The question of bringing back manufacturing, bringing back industrial jobs. This is his goal. He says he wants to have a more protectionist policy. We can talk about that, what that actually means, as opposed to just simple slogans. I think that, unfortunately, we hear a lot of slogans about this. You know, protectionism is bad. Okay, so Donald Trump is bad. Well, that's pretty simplistic. If we just look at it that way, then probably in 6 months or a year, we won't understand what happened. Same thing as in the election. People were so surprised because they didn't understand what was happening beforehand. Now, the other big area is foreign policy. And you heard very little about this during the campaign, but Donald Trump was very clear in criticizing U.S. foreign policy, the policy of regime change, of wars going around the world, mostly in the Middle East, spending $6 trillion on wars. And he said this money could have been used to rebuild the United States, to rebuild our roads, our bridges, right, our hospitals, our airports. And that's a very effective message. Right? So the question is, Russia. Is Donald Trump a Russian agent? No, I don't think Donald Trump is a Russian agent. Now, what I find here, again, very superficial is the treatment of the Russian question. Because there's something behind this. What we're seeing shadows. There's something behind this. There's a big political fight. There's a war going on in the institutions with people, Donald Trump and the people around him, who want to have better relations with Russia. And the general idea is this is bad. Putin is evil. Putin is bad. Therefore, if Donald Trump does this, he's a traitor. Right? Now, I think that there is a very legitimate argument to be made for changing our policy towards Russia as we've seen it in recent years. That doesn't mean we have to become Russian. It doesn't mean we have to love Putin. Right? It doesn't mean we have to be anti-freedom. Right? What it means is that the policy that's been followed of enlarging NATO to Russia's borders, for example, is a policy we need to question because it's becoming very dangerous. We're in a very dangerous situation right now, militarily, between the West and Russia. And finally, on this point, I think that the issue for Donald Trump is, in the election, there's all these questions made of, well, Putin helped Donald Trump get elected, right? And I think this is somewhat funny because it seems to be Vladimir Putin's fault that Hillary Clinton spoke to Goldman Sachs and took $675,000 for 3 speeches, right? Or it seemed to be it's Vladimir Putin's fault that the Democratic Party was favoring Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. Now, again, I have no doubt that the Russians can intervene with hackers and things like that. But I think we need to look at the actual problems which allowed this to happen.
You were disappointed. You don't agree
On what?
about this?
On the Russia issue?
Yeah.
If you want to talk about Russia seriously, not in a simplistic, slogany way like we heard just now, I'm happy to talk about it. Russia is a very serious matter. Donald Trump talked to me in depth about his desire to cooperate with Vladimir Putin to battle ISIS. And it's clear that that is what he and people around him would like to do. But never in the history of the United States has there been a question over the legitimacy of the election of an American president. And far from poo-pooing it, as my colleague did before, as not relevant or superficial or slogany, Russia will be the key to not only the future of American politics and Trump, but it will be the future of Europe's hopes for global stability and peace. And the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, both men who I've interviewed in the last 18 months, is central to understanding. And I read a great deal. I devote 2 chapters in the book to explaining how Trump and Putin can relate with each other. But what we have here is a situation where it is documented fact, as they say in Italian, prova provato, and not uncertain, that there was Russian hacking. It is documented fact that that Russian material that was hacked from Hillary Clinton's servers went to WikiLeaks, as Julian Assange went from being the hero of WikiLeaks to being a Russian stooge and puppet. And it is clear that there were contacts between Trump's team and the Russians before, during, and after the campaign. What's being investigated now is whether there was active cooperation between Trump's staff and the Russians, who would tell them when the WikiLeaks would appear, which would lead Donald Trump to then immediately use the WikiLeaks material against Hillary in the campaign. And that was certified by 17 U.S. intelligence agencies some months ago as being bona fide Russian interference. Whether the Russian interference was as active and as detailed as working hand in hand with Trump's people on the timing of the announcements, and whether there were any business interests between Trump's family and others and the Russians that may have conditioned this, we do not know. But Donald Trump's answer in a post-truth world, where you make up news, you say there was an attempt, a terrorist attempt in Sweden last night, which is false, was to invent a lie about Obama and to send out violent and unprecedented tweets on March 4th of this year, in which Trump accused Obama of wiretapping Trump Tower, said he was sick, said it was like Nixon and Watergate, said a whole bunch of lies. Why do we know they're lies? Because the current director of the FBI and the former head of the CIA, who would be personally, physically involved in that kind of wiretapping, went on television and went before the Senate to say there was no evidence of this. So what we're looking at is an attempt that Donald Trump is very good at to create false information to counter scandal and embarrassment. But he does this on many issues. He's in trouble on a trade issue, and protectionism is a serious matter because we're already seeing how Vespa scooters in Italy, San Pellegrino, and other products in Europe can be targeted by the Trump administration. We're seeing a Trump administration that is filled with people like Peter Navarro, the China hawk who's in charge of trade policy in the White House and who's written books and made movies predicting war with China in the next 5 to 10 years. We're dealing with some loonies, some real extremists around Trump. The grown-ups, the more serious people who are supposed to restrain Trump, are supposed to be the head of the Pentagon and the head of the State Department. But they're not in the White House, and they don't have access to Trump's Twitter account. Now, today, there was a piece of news just 2 hours ago that's important. Stephen Bannon, the ultra-conservative, racist chief of strategy of the White House, the man who's loved by the Ku Klux Klan and has very extremist views, was removed by Trump from the Principals Committee, one of the committees of the National Security Council. That shows that they're trying to get real. But we will see tomorrow and Friday, it will be very interesting to see Trump's meeting with the president of China at his club resort in Florida, because I'm sure we'll see President Xi coming in and Trump trying to clap him on the back, play golf, smile for the cameras and say everything's fine. But the truth is that America doesn't know, and Trump people don't know how to manage China. And my concern is they can do a lot of damage. The net result of Trump being weakened by the Russia scandal and being weakened by China's growth in Asia is probably that the irony is that Trump, who talks about making America great again and America first, is probably paving the way for America and Washington to lose influence over time. The most likely development is that we are going into a tripolar world where China and Russia are equal to American power in the future, and Europe, which is disunited and doesn't have a voice and can't get its act together, will be between irrelevant and marginal.
Okay, this is interesting view. But do you think that the American people who voted for Trump, they could understand this kind of matters? Because reading your books and in Andrew's book as well, I think that the economic part is prevalent. So it's more important for people just because this is the title of this book is Questa non è l'America. This is not America, because in our thinking, in our imagination, in America is a rich country with rich people, educated people. It's the land where every dream could be true. Everybody. What is the sentences in the sentence in your
chicken in every pot, a two-car garage.
Yeah, this is the sentence. Everybody think of this kind of America. If you read this book, I was shocked by the Walmart chapter. Walmart is the evil more than Trump, and what's happening now? Because people who are now jobless, poorer than 40 years ago, and the crisis hurt them very, very badly. They voted for Trump because it was a protest, and it's like you vote for some crazy, I said it's crazy, billionaire.
Former comedian.
Yes, but to solve their problem. But now we are in this condition. What do you think about this?
Well, one thing that Andrew
this is the question that it's for both.
It's good that we both
because
speak.
you have the same approach but slightly different. So,
well, I don't defend Putin. I leave that to Giulietto Chiesa and Andrew. No, I think one thing Andrew and I agree on definitely is that Trump is not, as Andrew correctly put it, not the cause but an effect. The way I would put it is that Trump is a symptom, a manifestation of American suffering over the years. And indeed, here we are seeing the victims of globalization, the victims of robotization and technology automation in factories, the forgotten class, and Trump used the expression the forgotten men, which came out of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's playbook in the 1930s. And I think there are many people in America who never had the American dream. I spent about 40 pages in one chapter, which in Italian is called C'era una volta l'America, in English, Once Upon a Time There Was in America, which is kind of a revisionist history, a controstoria of what really happened in America from the Vietnam War days, from the 1960s to today. And I'd be interested if Andrew agrees with this. My analysis is that America went through a lot of trauma. A lot of mistakes were made over the years, from Watergate to the Iran-Contra scandal to 9/11. We've had a country that systematically never quite managed to be comfortable with its role as the global policeman, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Bush administration of Father Bush and then Bill Clinton didn't really handle the collapse of the Berlin Wall very well. And many, many mistakes in American foreign policy committed by both Democrats and Republicans are to blame. But in this book, and this may surprise some people who think I'm just an anti-Trump writer, is that I am very, very harsh, and I bet you Andrew will agree on this as well, in my criticism of Bill Clinton. Because Bill Clinton, as president, helped create the conditions for the 2008 financial crisis. Bill Clinton and Alan Greenspan at the Fed and Bob Rubin at the Treasury in the 1990s went along with Republican plans to explicitly forbid the regulation of Wall Street derivatives trading or subprime mortgages. There's a law in 1999 that they pushed for that forbids the Commodities Trading Corporation Agency from monitoring these things. So they actually, mind you, the Secretary of the Treasury today in the Trump administration, Steve Mnuchin, was a Goldman Sachs banker working on subprime mortgages and derivative swaps and helped create the crisis of 2008 that we are now still recovering from. He's now the Secretary of Treasury, and once again they want to deregulate, and let Wall Street be free. Bill Clinton did another thing besides giving Wall Street its freedom and creating the conditions for the financial crisis. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton, a Democrat, said we must end welfare as we know it today. And Bill Clinton's cuts, tens of billions of dollars of welfare cuts and food stamps, helped to weaken the lower rungs of American society, as had Ronald Reagan in the 80s, as did George W. Bush. So for 30 years, from the 1980s right through the arrival of Obama, you had three presidents, two Republicans and one Democrat, who were systematically chopping away at the social state, at the welfare state, at assistance for America's poorest. So that's the precursor to Trump. Trump was the manifestation of this. He came along and saw these poor people, most of them not with college degrees, and he managed to sell them a bill of goods. He managed to imbrogliare, to cheat them, to persuade them that he would be good for them. And now what he's doing is helping Wall Street, the arms lobby, the pharmaceuticals lobby, the oil lobby, and everybody except the poor whites who voted for him.
Okay, thank you. Before I get to the question about the economy and about the people left out, just one final thing on Russia. Again, I think we have a situation. Yeah, well, since it's it's good to have a little bit of So it's true. James Clapper, director of National Intelligence, went on TV and said, "I didn't do anything." And the head of the FBI said, "I didn't do anything." They didn't do anything. Well, that's. Unfortunately, I don't trust James Clapper, the head of the director of National Intelligence. He also said we don't surveil our citizens, and that's not really true. Now, I defend the United States institutions greatly. That's one of the things that I aim to do. Donald Trump, obviously, what he said wasn't true. When Donald Trump accused Obama of wiretapping him, right? He said something, and Donald Trump is often his own worst enemy. He says stupid things, right? But Bob Woodward, pointed something out just a few days ago, or a week ago. So he said, look, yeah, what Donald Trump said isn't true, but there's a serious question of misconduct here, of illegal conduct, of the fact that the people who worked with Donald Trump, like Michael Flynn, whether we like him or not, were picked up in surveillance by our intelligence agencies, and those names were disclosed. That's against the law, right? And so there is something going on here. And again, I think that the major issue, right, is not the way Donald Trump puts it. Right? I think the major issue is do we need to change foreign policy towards Russia or not? And that's the debate that we need to have. Right? And I think that the rest of these things are more or less important. Some of them are more important. Some of them are not. But this is the major issue. Do we need to change policy towards Russia? This is very important for Italy. It's very important for Europe overall, as you know. Now, I agree with most of what you said, Alan, on especially from the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. Absolutely, these are things I'm glad to hear you say these things. There is a process which I think started in the 1970s, essentially, of moving towards the post-industrial economy. This was explicit. You've heard it. We're now in the service economy. We don't need heavy industry anymore. All right, that's going to go somewhere else. All right. And there was a process which I think was based essentially on low costs. Right? This is what we've seen. If we can make it cheaper somewhere else, then we're going to do it. And that was presented to people as progress, as something that's modern. You know, take Uber. Uber is presented as a tremendous progress because for some people it's very convenient, right? Now, but for the people who are working and aren't employees and are making a few dollars an hour, maybe it's not this huge progress. Right? There's the other side of things like Foodora, Uber, the sharing economy. Often for some people is no more economic security. Right? So these are the things that we have to look at as the economic process. Now, the policies in the 1990s, absolutely, Bill Clinton. You know, one of the things. Alan mentioned the CFTC, the Commodities Future Trading Commission, the Act. The other one was Glass-Steagall, the separation between commercial banks and investment banks. That is, the banks which give you your loans and have your bank accounts, and the banks which operate much more on Wall Street and in speculative. And Bill Clinton, under Bill Clinton, is when this rule was canceled in the United States. And similar things happened in Europe throughout the 1990s, earlier here actually, although it was a long process in the United States. In the Italian, 1993, well, absolutely, the banking laws were rewritten in Italy in 1993. Completely.
Universal banks remain in Italy and Europe, the rule. They never separated like Glass-Steagall, the banks.
No, there was something, in Italy there was something different though. And there was something called specialization in Italian. Yeah. Okay. It was special. It's not the same thing. Italy did not get into what the U.S. banks got into and what the German banks got into and what the British banks got into. And everyone criticized Italy for this. Italy, all the companies are too small. They're family-owned companies. They don't go into the stock market. You know, maybe they made a smarter choice sometimes on this issue. I think the big thing, these mistakes have been made over the years, but the thing to understand is they're based on a conception. They've all been defended in terms of neoliberal free market policies. The state should not intervene. We have to let the market work. Right? This has been defended as a new, wonderful ideology of freedom for everyone. But too often, this freedom has been used as freedom for Wall Street, freedom for the people to exploit those who no longer have protection. Right? And this, by the way, is not the history of the United States. The history of the United States is something else. We did not grow based on free market policies the way that they're considered today by Wall Street. We grew in opposition to the British Empire as the system of, sorry, I like the British, but the system of making the American worker compete with a slave somewhere else around the world. Abraham Lincoln, this was the way that the United States grew up in the 1800s. So protectionism in their sense, and it's very interesting that Donald Trump actually has mentioned some people from the 1800s, Henry Clay. Someone is feeding him some very interesting lines. Which makes me hopeful that there's a more serious discussion coming, hopeful. The way protectionism was seen as we need to promote industry, we need to promote infrastructure, and we need to make our workers richer. And that will help us increase trade because people will have money and they'll be able to buy things. Now, if that makes sense to you, it sounds a little bit like today. If you don't have a job, the fact that things are cheaper doesn't make that much difference to you.
I know that you want to reply to this. No, yeah, but I don't want to. So I have another last question, and then I will open the debate to everybody, so you can intervene if you want. And I'm reading this book, the both. I find a lot of things in common with the rise of populism in Europe. Slightly different, of course, because there are different parts of the world, but and the rise of five-star movement in Italy as well. And do you think it's a right vision, or do you think there is some connection? This is the question for both, of course.
I think the effect of Donald Trump on the European political scene is real. I think there are certain things that America and Europe have in common, in that the entire Western industrialized world is going through an existential crisis right now after 20, 30 years of globalization, with the advance of technology that can reduce between 30 and 50% of all jobs in Western society in the next 20 years. So very serious challenges ahead. I think I'm not worried about Marine Le Pen becoming the president of France, but I am worried that she carries on a tradition of thinly veiled anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, extreme nationalism from her fascist father, who was a fascist, Jean-Marie Le Pen. And Marine Le Pen has sort of tried to dress it up and project a more moderate image, sort of like Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump, is supposed to be the acceptable, friendly face of moderation in the White House, when in fact she is part of a crooked, complicit group of conflicted people. She keeps her company, her lousy clothing company. She goes to the White House and she becomes a counselor with her husband, the son-in-law of Trump, who has no qualifications except he's the son of a convicted, corrupt building Palazzinario, crook from New Jersey. So a lot of that going on. But in Europe, I think the wind of Trump and the influence of Trump and the influence of nationalism, which isn't just American, it's European-based as well, is fed in a different way. It's not, we never had a problem in America with Mexicans until Trump, huh? Fact, there was no problem with Mexicans. The number of Mexicans coming into America had gone down. Actually, in my book, I explain in a chapter on Mexico that they actually had a net outflow, more people leaving America than coming into America from Mexico in recent years, because the economy wasn't good enough and the Mexicans could do better at home. But Donald Trump invented that to get elected. Whereas in Europe, there's a French, a Muslim population that's been there for many years, the Algerians. There's in Germany, the former Gastarbeiter, the Turkish minorities who are there in Germany. Italy is still has a relatively small Muslim population compared to France and Germany, but Italy has, as it has many problems of an economic and social type, is probably the country that can be most effectively manipulated by populists. And what I mean by that is this. The real effect of the whole populism is, the popolo is sovrano. The American people elected Trump. He's our president. He's not my president, but he's the president of the United States officially, okay? I don't respect him, but he's the president. He's elected. In Europe, the populists tend to be more ultranationalists. Le Pen is a racist, anti-immigrant politician who has managed to go to Marseille and Nice and Lille and poor sections of France and say, it's the foreigners, it's the terrorists, it's the Muslims. And this is, she will not be the president because more than 50% of the French will hold their nose and vote for Macron or whoever emerges as number 2 or in line with Le Pen. But she's influenced the debate in France so much that everything is pushed over to the right. It used to be left-right, now it's center-right, extreme-right. That's the most important thing for journalists in this room to realize. You're growing up, you're graduating in a moment where the entire European and American political spectrum is not what it was for the last half century. It's being pushed further to the right by a virulent anti-immigrant and racist sensibility. In Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, fortunately, is small. And I'm not worried about Angela Merkel being reelected. She's beginning to look like the best thing, despite all the criticisms of her on austerity in European economic policy, in terms of human rights and in terms of fake news. The Germans yesterday introduced legislation to stop Facebook from publishing this fascist propaganda of Trump's people and Breitbart. So there's movement toward fighting fake news. I wish Italy would introduce legislation in France to stop the fake news. And of course, we see that influence, however, in Germany and France pushed to the right. In Britain, with the Brexit, we saw the influence of Nigel Farage. Brexit was probably won because of an anti-immigrant campaign, not because of the European economic equation. And that brings us to Italy. Here's the irony. Of all the big countries in Europe who could be influenced by this Trumpian shift to the right, by this energy for strongmen and authoritarian top-down populism, Italy is the one country that might elect its own Trump, and that is Beppe Grillo, who is not as right-wing as Trump, because remember, the five-star movement in Italy is an amalgam of left and right, and you're never sure. Certainly the structure of the five-star movement, pyramid, top-down, authoritarian, the son of an internet businessman in Milan tends to dictate policy together with a former comic in Genoa, and they don't really stand for very much. But that's the nature of things. But because there is, as they say in Italy, a rigurgito anti-establishment, which in English we could call a severe and strong anti-establishment strain in society, because after all, what has the establishment, what have the elites brought the poor people in Europe and America in the last 20, 30 years? Nothing. They've all suffered declines in net income. So you understand where it comes from. It comes from economics, comes from social unease, but Italy is the one country that could, if they screw up the election law, and the Italian politicians are very capable of screwing up the election law and taking Italy back into the 1950s with old-style proportional voting and tiny little parties and people making deal and all of that sort of thing. So Italy is going through a period of uncertainty where I think Renzi will ultimately beat back Grillo, but it's not at all clear. And in France and Germany and elsewhere in Europe, everything's been pushed to the right. That's the lasting influence of Trump and of populism and of the fear of immigrants that leads to more racism in Europe.
Okay, Andrew, your vision?
Okay, now Donald Trump would not have been elected if these problems, which we've both been talking about for years, for decades, had been dealt with. Right? If the elite, if the political and financial institutions had decided to actually change, make up for their mistakes, go in a different direction. The same thing is in Europe. Le Pen, Wilders, he got a lot of votes, but he can't make a government. He didn't come in first. Germany, five-star movement in Italy. These things would not happen if European policy had been different. And so the question is, what needs to change? Right now, nationalism in the United States, I think there's a difference, a qualitative difference between nationalism in the United States, for the most part, apart from some people who are certainly racists in the United States, and that in Europe. And I think in the United States, many of the people in the population, when they're anti-establishment, their view, they try to go from the United States Constitution. It may be a simple understanding of certain rights, but it's based on the United States identity, which is not the same as the identity in European countries, which is more of a blood and soil identity. Right? And so we've seen different manifestations of nationalism over the course of history. So what are the differences? What are the problems? Why is it that Marine Le Pen can talk about the European Union so effectively, about the euro? The problem is, again, we say, okay, Le Pen is terrible, she's racist. Okay, well, why is it that she's getting support? We need to deal with these things. The European Union has followed a policy for decades now, and in particular in the last 10 years, even much worse, austerity for the people and unlimited money for the banks. That's to put it simply as a slogan. But look at the US did it, the European Central Bank is doing it, right? We say we have to keep getting money to the banks so they'll lend to the economy. But for the people, we have to keep raising your taxes and cutting your services. Well, and people say, oh, well, gee, that's Europe for me. That's the European Union. How wonderful, right? So we need to deal with these problems. And if my suggestion, my advice to journalists is, if you want to stop the nationalists, the populists, don't assume that they're all racist. Don't assume that anyone who criticizes the euro or the European Union is a racist. If you do that, you'll only help them. What we need to do, right, is actually deal with the problems that are raised.
Questo di cose, non confondo l'essere anti-europeo con razzismo. I don't mix together the two. I know, but I disagree with the point, because I think racism and anti-immigrant sentiment is what is inspiring a lot of people in Europe right now. The issue of economic insecurity caused by austerity, I think, combines with the anti-immigrant fear to make for the current situation we have in Europe.
I would actually agree with you in the sense that I think that one feeds the other. There's academic research that has shown that, and there's been some excellent reporting by The Guardian, which I read, of saying, you know, the anti-immigrant sentiment was a major, if not the major factor, but of people saying, if you've got money, you vote Remain. If you don't have money, you vote Leave. I mean, some people see it that way.
This is what I was saying. I live in London, and the Brexit was the same. The starting or the kick of the Brexit was this. So it was not racism, not only, but poor people voted for Leave, and this is why poor people in US voted for Trump, and maybe poor people and the more marginals vote for Beppe Grillo here and everybody in Europe. So this is the point. Okay, so if we started with some delay, with 15 minutes late. If you want to, we have a few minutes for questions. If you want, take 2 or 3. Yeah, we're taking a question together, and here, there.
One question for Alan Friedman, and maybe a comment from the other panelists as well. Mr. Friedman, you said Europe will be irrelevant and marginal. How do you see the future of Europe?
That's a long story, and probably Romano Prodi and I were presenting the book in Bologna the other night, and he said that I should write my next book and call it Questa non è l'Europa. This is not Europe, because Europe is going through quite its own crisis. Europe doesn't count in foreign policy, doesn't count in the Middle East, doesn't count very much in global affairs. Europe is a trading bloc that is politically disunited. So Putin is a Machiavellian power player and dictator and a strongman, and China is increasing its influence across Asia and Africa right now. And I said that I thought Trump's end result would be to weaken American influence. It'll remain powerful, but relatively less so. I don't see any prospects of the European Union, which I love. I love the idea of a united Europe. I would love there to be a United States of Europe. I believe in the federalist vision of Europe. But I think there is no chance that Europe can get it together. There is no chance that in the near term meaning in the next year or two, that Europe will count in international decision-making. The key decisions will not be made in Brussels. They'll be made in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow.
Yeah, okay. Take some more.
Allora io volevo domandare solo questo, che ai tempi di Obama si è perso AAA. Dopo c'era la guerra con agenzie rating e Obama ha detto che il problema dell'America è proprio Wall Street, che è obsoleto. E di questo non si parla. Invece qua c'è essenza di tutto, secondo me. Che adesso Trump ha risolto il problema perché ha fatto credere che, diciamo, chi investe nella borsa, e sembra che il problema non c'è più, che il sistema obsoleto del Wall Street non esiste.
Ok, abbiamo capito. Prendiamone almeno un'altra qua e poi...
Okay, thank you both very much for your commentary. I think you both have framed this large as an economic issue, and that the poor working class people that have been ignored by neoliberalism have responded in protest. But many of Trump's supporters are middle class and wealthy white people throughout the United States, and race has not really been brought up as one of the primary factors. A large amount of the American working class is African American, immigrant, etc. They did not vote for Trump. So I'm curious to hear your commentary on Trump's presidency as actually a response to the symbolic victory of Obama's presidency.
Okay, and the last one there.
You mostly focus on the internal aspects, the problems of the American society, etc. But do you really think that Trump's foreign policy would be isolationist and non-interventionist? Because the first actions in Syria and Yemen actually point out even more aggression.
Yeah, big questions. Okay. Andrew, you start.
Okay, the future of Europe. I think the question that in Europe that has to be asked is, what is Europe for? I think, why do you want the European Union? Because many different reasons have been given. You want the European Union not to have war. Well, the 50 years of peace in Europe all came before the euro. So it's not the euro that defends peace necessarily. There's maybe something else. Is Europe for geopolitical reasons? Is it for human rights? I think we need to define clearly what it is. Otherwise, you have certain countries with one view of why Europe should go forward and using it for their own purposes, and other countries which disagree. The question of middle class and wealthy. It's obvious there are a lot of people. Middle-class people who voted for Trump, absolutely. And it's not true that the poor people voted for Trump. Some poor people voted for Trump, sure, but that's not, it's been demonstrated there are plenty of people who were not poor. But the people who do remember or have an idea of the United States that is different now, that is, they have less stable work, they don't have the same thing they had before. I think that it's obvious that there is a question of race, but I don't believe that it is a backlash against Obama's America. I am 45 years old. I was happy. People in my generation were very happy to vote for a black man to become president. And I don't think that the United States became racist 8 years afterwards. Those are issues. There's absolutely issues. But look, someone from David Duke ran for Senate in Mississippi. He got 7% in Mississippi. Okay, that's a state where the KKK might do pretty well. He got 7%. So is that there? Yes, that's there. But look, you say those people didn't vote for Trump. Well, Hillary Clinton got 5% less than Obama did from black voters. You say, oh, well, Obama was black. Well, Lyndon Johnson got more black voters than Obama did. That was 50 years ago, but it's about policy. Hillary Clinton got 10% less than Obama did from union households. And that's Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And what about the people who didn't go to vote? They couldn't stomach Donald Trump, but they didn't decide to go vote for Hillary Clinton. So I think the things are mixed together. They're mixed. So you have to look at what are the reasons of a lack of trust in the political class. And that shows up in various ways. There's the racist aspect, there's a xenophobic aspect, but that is not nearly enough. And I defend the United States of America and our population and even people who voted for Trump. That is not nearly enough to get someone like Trump elected without all of these other factors. Huge mistakes that have been made that need to be corrected.
I think we already disposed of the three reasons why Trump was elected. One, the racism and the exploitation of the working class poor, which was the main factor. It's true that 48% of college-educated women voted for Trump. There was a lot of voting along party lines. Republicans voted for Trump to cut taxes. But it was the exploitation of the working classes and the underclasses of America that made the difference. And I'll explain to Andrew and all of you how that worked. In the Reagan 80s, there was something called Reagan Democrats, and they were white working class poor people and unionized people who voted for Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, in the same way that uneducated, ignorant, blue-collar workers in Britain voted for Margaret Thatcher, working class Tories. That happened in America in the 80s. It happened in 2016 as well. It was a major, if not the only factor of Trump's election, which doesn't mean that the middle class didn't vote for him. There's a broader point here as we conclude this interesting conversation, and that's this. As an American, I used to believe in the American dream. I campaigned for Bobby Kennedy when I was a small boy, and I actually believed in the American dream, that America was a country that offered opportunity for everyone. But months and months of slogging across America and meeting real Americans and not just big shots reminded me of what an ignorant and sad country America has become, and reminded me that there never really was an American dream for poor whites. There never, maybe in the 50s and 60s, but after that, no. There never really was an American dream for poor blacks. There never was an American dream for many women. And today, women are being treated badly and horribly by the Trump administration. We risk going backward in time in the United States 50 or 60 years Trump is planning to cut abortion funding, family planning, environmental coverage. The list goes on and on. He's also planning to make it more difficult for Afro-Americans to vote through voter suppression, gerrymandering, and other moves by the Civil Rights Department of the Justice Department, which will in time be shown to be racist. I don't use the word racist lightly. It's a heavy word to use. But there once was an America I was proud of. There once was an America where at least you could hope. And for you as Europeans in the global arena, there once was an America that seemed, despite the imperialist stupidity of Vietnam, despite the idiocy of going into Afghanistan and Iraq of George W. Bush, despite these horrible mistakes and errors and imperialist acts, there once was an America that stood for stability, free markets, and somehow wanted to lead the world on issues like climate change, and Obama did that. Today, the president of China is flying, as we sit here in Perugia, on his way to Florida, as the defender of free trade in the world, as the defender of the Paris Climate Change Accords, the president of China. That should tell you all you need to know. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Alan Friedman. Thank you, Andrew. And I don't know if we can stay here to sign the copies. I don't know. Okay. There's nobody. Okay, we can stay here. So if someone wants to get a copy of the Alan Friedman book, you can have a sign. Okay. Sorry, can you bring back the... no, in italiano, scusate. Potete restituire per favore gli auricolari? Gli italiani rimettano a posto gli auricolari. Grazie. About the American mess, and we are very proud of it, because sometimes it's good to say that there are mess everywhere and not only in Italy. And Andrew Spanau is a journalist, and he is a politologo, how do you say it? Political analyst. And he has a blog whose name is transatlantico.info, and they both predicted in some way the Trump will gonna win. So there are two topics in both books very interesting to me, because there are, one is the economic sides of the matter, and one is where the USA is put in the foreign affairs. So these are the two big topics in both.
Get you jobs. I will build a wall. I will close the border. You know. And all these empty promises given in the style of an, third world strongman. The authoritarian nature of his campaign and the authoritarian nature of the government right now is very worrying to those of us who believed once in the human rights being an American value and in international order. The third reason why Trump was elected was because there was Russian involvement in the campaign. We don't know to what extent Russian secret agents were working actively together with Trump's people, although there is some circumstantial evidence that suggests that. But we do know that there was hacking by the Russians of the Hillary machinery. We do know that that was given to WikiLeaks, and we do know that some of Trump's top people were giving advance word about what would come out from the Russian hackers. So this will be the biggest scandal in the American government for the next few months, the Russiagate scandal, and is the only thing that can undo the Trump presidency in the next year or so. I don't believe in impeachment. I don't think Republicans will impeach a Republican president, but the Russiagate scandal is what you should keep your eye on. Donald Trump himself, who I knew first in the 80s and then met again during Cafoni in Italian, for those who don't speak Italian. I suppose you could translate as Bulgarian. This book is more about why Trump was elected, what happened to America. The first half of the book is a piece of social anthropology, if you wish, in which I traveled to 16 states from Mississippi to Ohio, around the country, to look at the poverty, the racism, the violence, the gun violence, and the state of our divided nation. And of course, when it comes to the election of Trump, many people ask me, well, why did he get elected? And I usually say there's three main reasons why Trump was elected. Number one, because he had a very poor rival in Hillary Clinton, a Democratic candidate who was hated and not trusted by 60% of the American people. Same as Trump, but a poor rival. The Americans were sick of the Clintons, and Hillary was just not a good candidate. Secondly, mainly, Trump, together with the help of people like Stephen Bannon, his chief strategist, were able to exploit the fear and the anger of a lot of poor white people who saw in Trump a kind of savior. I will...
which language to use, and Alan said, I'm using both. So, and I'll do the same, and maybe Andrew will do the same. If someone who is mother tongue English doesn't understand Italian, please hand up half and half. Yes. So this is why we are saying. Okay, we are doing it in English. The other question is, how many Italian doesn't understand English? Okay, this is a democratic assembly, so we do it in English. But this book is in Italian, so I start with this book in Italian and then split it to English, okay? Or not. Okay. Alan Friedman, do you know, he's very famous in Italy. He wrote a lot of books about the Italian mess. And for the first time, this book is in both books. And I will start with Alan, which his book is, this is the book, and is first on the top 10 this week. Yeah, so he's very proud. He arrived and said, my book is first, okay, and I said it, and you're glad? And this book starts with a very impressive description of Trump in his plane. Tell us about this. This is the first meeting that he had with Trump, and it was quite impressive to me to understand what kind of person is Trump.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. I started the book with the meeting I had with Trump on the plane, although I'd like to make clear that although I predicted that Trump would be president back in February 2016 in the Corriere della Sera, At the time I wrote in Italian that this is a cafone who you have to take very seriously, and indeed the cafone is now the President of the United States.